Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. God help us all when I ask yet again, expecting nothing good, what's new and exciting in your world this weekend?
We received last week an email from listener George Walker. He sent an article on recent fiscal developments and asked us to comment. The article, appearing in Politico, uses a linguistic trick that politicians and the media employ when they want to soften the blow of fiscal news. It says, quote, "The U.S. government posted a record decline in federal deficits in fiscal 2022.
I loved this one. This is great.
As surging tax revenue and waning spending helped cut the budget gap in half."
Waning spending? You gotta be kidding me.
The less careful reader may read into the statement things that aren't true, which is, of course, the politician's hope. Record decline in federal deficits sounds great, and I suppose it is good news, but the deficit is not the same as a debt. The debt is what we owe. The deficit is what we're adding to the debt this year. So a record decline in federal deficit means that the federal government is bleeding out at a slower rate this year than last.
How much extra money are we going to throw in the debt this year, this record year of a gigantic downturn?
Instead of adding $2.8 trillion to the debt as we did last year, this year we're only adding $1.4 trillion.
These people can all officially ass.
So I dug into this and I'm wondering what's driving this decline in the deficit. I pulled the numbers going back to the 1950s or so, adjusted everything for inflation. And if you adjust for inflation, tax revenues are up 14% this year, while spending is down 20%. And of course, everybody's cheering about that, and that's an example of fiscal discipline. The 20% drop in spending sounds like great news, but it's due to the end of COVID-era stimulus spending. Even with the 20% drop, spending this year is 6% higher than it would have been had the trend since 2010 continued without the COVID interruption. In other words, there's a 6% increase in spending sitting there that appears to be a permanent residue of the COVID stimulus packages. And here's the thing, if it weren't for that 6% spending residue, the deficit this year would have been well under $1 trillion for the first time since, adjusting for inflation, 2009. And as a side note, I have to say, I've come so often over the past 6 months to have to use the words inflation-adjusted terms, and I'm so sad about that. In the time before COVID, inflation was low enough that when looking at numbers over the course of a decade, you could pretty much ignore inflationary effects. But that's not the case anymore.
It's not likely to be the case for quite some time.
Yeah, unfortunately. Now, here's a question. On the one hand, we're saying, yes, we're seeing a 20% decline in spending, but that's really us just shutting off that fire hose of COVID stimulus that was going on. On the other hand, our tax revenues are up 14% versus last year. So what's going on there?
Maybe that's all them IRS agents they hired.
Not yet, it isn't, but hold on to your seats for that for next year. It turns out that this year, individual income tax collections are up more than 30% versus last year. Now, some of that is due to capital gains from investors cashing out of the stock market. We're all aware that the stock market topped out and started coming down. Well, what causes that? It's from investors selling off stocks. And what happens when you sell off stocks? You're now showing capital gains and that gets taxed. So some of that 30% jump in income tax collections is due to that cashing out of stocks. That kind of sounds like what you would expect from a burgeoning economy. An economy is doing well, people are earning more money, so incomes are up, so therefore tax revenues are up, except it's actually smoke and mirrors. Part of the reason tax revenues are up is because of an interaction between a progressive tax code and inflation. With a progressive tax code, of course, the more you earn, the higher a percentage tax you pay. With inflation, you get pushed into higher tax brackets because you're earning more dollars, even though those dollars aren't buying you any more stuff. I'll give you an example. Over the past 12 months, personal income in the U.S. has risen almost 4%. We're bringing home about 4% more dollars than we did 12 months ago. But the purchasing power of that income has shrunk 4%. So we're bringing home 4% more dollars, but each of those dollars is buying 8% less stuff, leaving us on net 4% worse off than we were before. But the tax code doesn't care about that. All the tax code cares about is how many physical dollars did you bring home, not how much stuff those dollars buy. So even though we're all poorer in terms of purchasing power, the tax code is treating us as if we're richer, bumping us into higher tax brackets.
I want to get to something that happened back in August. You might remember that Salman Rushdie was attacked as he gave a lecture.
Yes, I do recall.
After quite a lot of time in the hospital, turns out Salman Rushdie has lost the use of one eye and one hand.
Oh my God, really?
Which is brutal. And you start to think, okay, we live in a liberal society. How do these things happen? The minute you take a look around, there are illiberal elements everywhere you look. The more illiberal you become, the more a problem you are.
Liberal, you don't mean conservative liberal. You mean free or less free.
Yes, we live in a liberal regime. We're probably the most liberal regime that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Yet we all see these illiberal elements. The attacker was a 24-year-old man, a man barely started in his adult life. And yet there was a long line of people who were ready to do this. Why? Because Salman Rushdie insulted Islam in a book called The Satanic Verses, which was released, 30 years ago?
Yeah.
He's been underground more or less ever since. He said he was just starting to feel like his life was normal again. And here comes this man attacking him as he gives a talk. And if you look around, you see more of agitating for violence because their preferred presidential candidate did not win. That is an illiberal element. Part of being a liberal society is that you understand that you can lose politically and then you go away. And you come back 2 and 4 years later and you see maybe if you've done a better job and people like you a little more. You don't agitate for an overthrow of the United States government.
I am not equating it to the attack on Rushdie, but I am saying it is of the same family. And that is the cancel culture, where you say these books, we're going to ban them, or this person, we're going to shun them, or whatever it is. It's a small step, granted, but it's a step in that direction of illiberality.
I think it's much more problematic than you do. As long as one group of people can whine loud enough and have another group of people shut down completely, we've gone too far. Part of living in a liberal society is that everybody gets to say whatever they want. We move on to the foolishness of the week, and I will say this one was directly inspired, yea, given to me by the fair Fiona Harrigan, who writes and podcasts in all of her own ways. I want you to think about the time of the year and ask yourself, Aunt, what happens at about this time every single year?
Pumpkin pie.
God, you're an idiot. Pumpkin pie does, in fact, happen at this time of year. Clearly, that's not what I'm after. What I'm after is, yet again, a scare that children are going to get all kinds of drugs in their candy as they get their Halloween goodies. I think that a variation of this has been pushed every year since I was about 3.
When I was younger, it wasn't that, it was razor blades in candy.
I'm including razor blades in this. First, we had to put all the candy on the table and make sure there weren't little tiny openings in any of the packages. Then we had to bring them to a public place where they could be x-rayed. You know who got a razor blade in his candy, Aunt? No one. Who got drugs in their candy? No one. Why?
It's pretty expensive.
That's right. These people know how to make a living. You don't have to get people hooked on drugs. People want drugs. They will seek you out. Don't you worry. This idea that we will birth a legion of young addicts, I have no idea who takes that seriously. The news media is back at it again, latching on to what? A Drug Enforcement Administration memo, the title of which, DEA warns of brightly colored fentanyl used to target young Americans. This is so stupid, I don't even know what to say about it. If anybody within the sound of my voice, if you're taking a young person out trick-or-treating and it happens to be the case that you get some drugs in with the candy, Can you mail me the drugs?
Oh, no. That violates all
them.
sorts of federal laws.
I'm pretty okay understanding that there's not going to be anybody mailing me anything.
Right, yeah.
And given that, maybe instead you could just send me the candy. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, preferred.
Really? I would have never guessed you for Reese's Peanut Butter Cups.
I love them. One of the greatest things in the world is that 1 pound peanut butter cup that shows up at Christmas. You have to eat it with a knife.
It's like a pie.
It is like a pie. It seems to weigh like 10 or 12 pounds. All right, so maybe don't send me the drugs. Just report back on the success you have had. I'm guessing it will be 0.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org.
Samir Hanudia, listener of our august podcast, asks us to cover Treasury bills. Now, I don't know what could be so wrong with Samir.
That he wants to hear about Treasury bills.
I mean, my God, what are you doing with your life? But I suspect he's actually not the only one. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I don't think I understand all that well how this market works either. So maybe as a way of tutorial, this will be at least valuable to fill in some information that most of us lack. The cost, of course, is going to be that this is going to be so boring. It's going to hurt. Literally anything else would be more interesting than this.
There are several things here, and Samir mentioned all 3 of them. Treasury bills, Treasury notes, and Treasury bonds. And
do you hear that sound, Ant, of my brain giving up its will to live? I'm wandering into sleep mode already, and you've barely gotten started.
They're just 3 variations on the same thing. These Treasury things, bonds, notes, bills. This is what the federal government issues as debt. These are contracts. It's a piece of paper that says the federal government promises to pay you a certain amount of money at some date in the future. And that's it. You pay for this piece of paper. In paying for the piece of paper, you have, in effect, loaned money to the federal government. We use these 3 terms, Treasury bills, Treasury notes, Treasury bonds. The difference is how long they last. Treasury bills are very short-term loans, 1 month to 1 year. Treasury notes are 2 to 10 years, and Treasury bonds are over 10 years. They go as high as 30 years. So you loan your money to the federal government, and you don't get it back for 30 years. One of the things that people say is that you're guaranteed your money here because ultimately the federal government, technically the Federal Reserve, but the federal government can print money. So you're guaranteed to get this money back.
Well, sure you are, but it's going to be worth less, not worthless, but literally worth less when you get it back. You're giving the government a loan, but the government can print more money, so the loan you're giving it ends up being a drop in a gigantic bucket.
I've had this conversation a couple of times, and when I get to the part I'm going to tell you, I can see the gears clashing in people's heads. People will say to me, well, you're guaranteed to get your money back because the federal government can print money, so you don't have to worry about government going bankrupt or anything like that. And that's true, but it's a play on words. Because really, when you loan money to the federal government or loan money to anybody, what you want back is the purchasing power of that money. The money itself is not relevant.
Plus the interest. You expect, reasonably so, that the money you get back is going to be worth more than the money you put in.
Right. And when you say worth more in terms of purchasing power, that it'll buy more than the money you put in the first place.
We can call these things dollars if we want, but that's not the relevant part. The relevant part is what you can use them for.
Yeah, and so if we get to an extreme case where the government can't pay its bills and it just starts printing money, you get inflation like, dare I say, we have right now.
And really, you're going to say, if we get to a point like that?
Right. As we get to this point.
We have been at that point for quite some time now.
You're not exaggerating here. Back when we issued all those checks during the age of COVID, the numbers were astounding. I think in 2020, we spent the federal government spent $6 trillion. Under normal circumstances, the government would spend $4 trillion. In 2020, it spent $6 trillion.
Let me hold you right there, because 4 is already too many.
Yes, that's already more than they bring in tax revenue. One of the things that happens is a lot of people have this idea that the government's sitting on a whole bunch of money, and so it just takes it out of its bank the same way we do. No, it didn't have this money.
People think government spending is magic.
Right.
They don't understand what happens, so they compartmentalize it. We get all kinds of spending that nobody even thinks to raise a hand and say, excuse me, isn't this going to come back to bite us?
It comes back in the form of inflation. Inflation goes to this purchasing power we're talking about. When you have inflation, your dollar's losing purchasing power. And so, yes, the government can print as many physical dollar bills as it wants to pay its debt, but it can't print purchasing power. And it's purchasing power that you're trying to get back when you loan somebody money.
Because this is an investment. You could leave it in a checking account. Okay, you're not going to get anything. You could leave it in a savings account. Okay, you're going to barely get 1%. You could invest it in the market. Well, careful, you might lose everything. And enter the government with safe investment products. That's the line they use, right? That you can invest in these things and your money will be safe. You will not lose your principal. And everybody says, oh, that sounds great. Let's do that then.
Technically, they're not lying. You do get your money back, but you don't necessarily get your purchasing power back, and that's what we all care about. So let's look at some of the numbers. I just looked up the recent rates of return on Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. The short-term loans, those are 3% currently.
And that's an annualized 3%.
Yeah, that's annualized.
It's not like you buy one and you get 3% back.
Yes, you get the equivalent of 3% over the course of a year. And then 30-year Treasury bills are going at about 3.5%, 3.6%. 3% return 2-3 years ago, that would have been okay, given that your savings account was making 0.5%. But today, with inflation at 8%, my God, you put your money into a Treasury bond yielding 3.6%, let's round it off to 4%. But inflation eats 8%, you're 4% worse off at the end of the year. Now, there is a special type of Treasury bill that the government started issuing, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. Inflation-indexed Treasury bills.
I'm angry already. Only the federal government could cause inflation and then sell you a product based on the problem it served.
That's right. Now, as you might imagine, the interest rate on them is way low. It's like 1% currently.
Way to go, federal government.
That's 1% after inflation.
I never heard of them until right this second.
Right.
Well, look, that tells you something, right? It's not like I'm an ignoramus on investment products, and yet this one's brand new to me.
So here's the mechanics of how this works. Congress runs a deficit, so it needs to borrow money. The government will print a bunch of these Treasury bonds or notes or bills, pieces of paper saying that we promise to give you a certain amount of money at some point in the future, and sells them on the market. And people buy them like you would buy anything, stocks or corporate bonds or anything else. Investors buy these things. If you picture the flow of items, you've got these pieces of paper, the bonds, going from the government to investors, and dollars going from investors to the government. That's the money that the government is now going to spend. It contributes to the deficit and the debt. But one of the things that people get concerned about is they'll point to China, and I believe China owns about $1 trillion worth of Treasury debt. And they'll say things like, well, that's bad because China could call in those loans.
Well, let's hang on a second, because politically, that's actually a very good thing. The more that foreign governments hold our debt, the better off we are, because all of a sudden they will defer to us politically in order to be guaranteed the repayment of these debts.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. All of a sudden, going to war, that's a very costly business.
China is never going to war with the United States because it wants its money back.
It wants its $1 trillion back, exactly. But the thing that people say is that, well, China can call in its loans. I guess the idea being that China just decides, okay, we want our $1 trillion back. And that's not how this works. These treasuries are contracts. They say that the government will pay you back at a specific date in the future. You can't ask for the money before that.
And here's where it gets interesting. It's rolling debt.
Yes, it's rolling debt. So as they expire and the government pays them off, it issues more. It's exactly like you opening up a new credit card and writing a check on that to pay off the other credit card.
And as long as that's true, what you're going to find is that governments will crawl into bed with each other and they will play nice for a very long time.
Yeah, nobody wants to upset that apple cart because all sorts of problems ensue. So I guess you raise a good point that from a political perspective, this is a really good thing.
It's a great deal
to have governments intertwined like this.
It would be a cost-effective deal as well if we didn't spend so much on military things.
Now, what do you do if you've purchased one of these bonds? Let's say you bought a 30-year bond for roughly $1,000, and 5 years down the road, you want your $1,000 back. Well, the government's not obligated to give it to you. The bond doesn't expire for 30 years. But these bonds are what we call transferable, meaning you can just go onto the open market and sell it, and somebody else will buy it from you. And so you get your money back, not from the government, but from this person that bought it from you. And if the person's holding it 30 years from now, the government will pay them the money back.
For somebody to buy it, they will have to expect that they'll make a profit, which determines the price, which means you may not get your principal back.
And that truth that you stumble upon here explains something strange that we saw not in this country, but in Europe. Interest rates in Europe, some of them, went negative. Now, this was on government debt, mind you.
But that's crazy.
That is strange. Yeah, think that through. So that means
That means you voluntarily buy something that will end up costing you money.
Right. So I loan you $1,000 with the agreement that 5 years from now you'll pay me back $900. Well, that's stupid. That's a negative interest rate.
That's right. Only government could be at the end of something that dumb.
We actually had at my university a discussion, and a bunch of the faculty were sitting around talking about this thing and how do you explain negative interest rates? And I said, well, one possible explanation is that what's happened is players in the market, investors, have come to the conclusion that the central bank is going to print a bunch of money to buy up these bonds in the future.
Not a bad assumption.
And so I'll pay you more than the face value on the bond because I anticipate that later on I'm going to be able to sell it to someone who pay me even more still. And that's a stupid thing. Why would someone pay me more still than the face value on the bond and what the bond's going to pay off? The only way you can get that chain of events is if the guy at the end doesn't care. That is, he prints the money, so he'll pay whatever just to pick up this bond. Negative interest rates may indicate the market's expectation that the central bank is going to massively inflate the money supply at some point in the future.
Any number of people who run various types of funds, by the bylaws of the fund, must be fully invested. If it looks like being fully invested is a stupid thing, they still have to be fully invested. So they're going to take the least obnoxious way out of that conundrum. You can figure out what you're going to make on a bond, and you could never figure out what you're going to make on a stock.
So you may be willing to take a guaranteed 1% loss instead of a potential 10% loss. Right.
But that's the only way I can see any of this nonsense making any sense at all.
That's a good explanation also. So I quoted the current interest rates on treasuries, anywhere from 3 to 3.6%. To put that in perspective, AAA corporate bonds, so these are the safest corporate bonds in the U.S., 4.6%, full percentage point more. Mid-grade corporate bonds, 5.7, almost 6%. And then the S&P 500 stocks were down 13% on an annualized basis since last quarter.
I kind of want to go and just buy a bunch of stocks at this point. But of course, there's a lot of downside there too, right? When you're looking at investment products, these are inherently risky. It matters what your risk tolerance is.
Now, historically, the S&P 500 has gained, I think the average is 10% per year, but that's on average over a long period. We're talking 20 years, 30 years.
Not last quarter.
So if you're a 30-year-old looking to retire 30 years in the future, the stock market's down a lot this year. Don't worry about it. Keep putting money into it as you do. It'll come back up. But if you're looking to retire next year, yeah, you probably shouldn't be in equities.
No, that's right. And I have this discussion with older people all the time. If you're in your 70s or 80s and you're invested in the market, what's wrong with you?
There's a footnote here, and this footnote goes along with the fact that neither one of us are investment advisors, and that is that you could be, for example, let's say 70 years old, you're retired, Some of your retirement money you're going to be spending in the near future. That should probably be in bonds. Some of it you may not be spending for 15 years. And that part could be in equities. That's okay. Right now, what's going on is the Federal Reserve is cutting back on the money supply, trying to control inflation. And the phrasing that's used, you'll rarely hear people in the media or even the Federal Reserve, when it's making statements, say contract the money supply. What they say is raise interest rates. And so that's the headline. Your Federal Reserve raised interest rates 0.75 of a point or whatever it is. What's going on here is those two things are synonymous. When the Fed cuts back on the money supply, interest rates go up. What happens here is it's more difficult to try and measure the money supply than it is to measure interest rates. So the Fed will cut back on the money supply and watch what happens to interest rates. So it'll have in its mind, we want interest rates to go up 1%. It'll cut back on the money supply until interest rates get up 1%, and then they'll let off. One of the strange things that people have said, and I think this comes from, if it doesn't come from the modern monetary theory people, it's related to them. And that is that you have to have government debt in order to have money. That somehow this idea that if there were no government debt, there would be no money. That makes no sense to me. As an example, we could point back to Andrew Jackson, the only president in our history, from Washington to the present, who paid off the debt. And guess what? We still had money. So we've got some related questions. Who owns the federal debt? That is, who do we owe this money to?
Well, as luck would have it, Ant, we owe it to ourselves, therefore it doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, now that's part of it. About a quarter of it is intragovernmental. And I was actually on the Treasury's website today reading about this, and they say almost those words, James. Don't worry about it. This is money we owe to ourselves. This is something that people say with a straight face, that it's money the government owes itself. To get your head around this, picture it as follows. You have a fund set up to pay for your kids' college educations, and you have a fund set up to go on vacation. And you decide you're going to go on vacation, and there's not enough money in the fund to go on vacation. So what do? You take a couple $1,000s out of the kids' college fund, and you put it in the vacation fund, and you say, well, but that's just money we owe ourselves. Which, on the one hand, it's correct. It is just money you owe yourself. But on the other hand, when it comes time for your kid to go to college, guess what? He's going to be minus several $1,000s because you went on vacation. So on the one hand, it's correct to say it's money we owe ourselves. On the other hand, it's also correct to say that, yeah, but if you don't pay that back, you're not going to be able to make good on the promises that you've made. And what are the promises here? The promises principally are retirement funds. Intergovernmental debt is the federal government borrowing money from government employee pensions, borrowing money from Social Security. Ultimately, it's going to have to pay that money back, either that or say to retirees, I'm sorry, we don't have any money to pay you in your retirement. So that's about a quarter of the debt. Another quarter are foreign governments. We owe about a quarter of the debt to foreign governments. Another quarter is Americans, non-governmental Americans, so put aside the Federal Reserve, put aside state and local governments, think about people, think about U.S. companies. They hold about a quarter of the debt. And the other quarter goes to state, local governments and the Fed, principally the Fed. So it's kind of how it breaks out into fourths. Intergovernmental debt, foreign governments, Americans, and then the Fed. And then maybe the last thing that's of interest here is not just the magnitude of the debt, but the rate at which it's been growing. So right now, we just crossed, I think recently, the $31 trillion mark. I pulled the data on the debt going back to the 1960s. If you apply the appropriate mathematics, it turns out that our federal debt is doubling about every 8 to 9 years.
Well, that would explain the gigantic number that we all see.
Right. This is an exponential growth. It's doubling every 8 to 9 years.
I'm prone to caring about this. And yet I see the numbers, and now they're just numbers. They no longer have any meaning whatsoever.
If you look backwards in time, you'll see this. This is 2022. 8 years ago, roughly 2014, the debt was $17 trillion, a little bit more than half of what it is now. 8 years before that, it was $8 trillion, about half of that. 8 years before that, it was 5. 8 years before that, it was 3. On average, it's doubling every 8 to 9 years, which means come 2030, which isn't that far off, we should be seeing $60 trillion. And come 2038, we should be seeing $120 trillion.
Good God. It just gets ridiculous.
Yeah, so where does this end? It ends ultimately when Congress gets its act together. The pain we're feeling is inflation. Inflation comes from printing too much money, which comes from the government borrowing too much money, which comes from the government spending too much money, which comes from Congress.
We all know it's never going to end. You're just sitting there smirking. Even you know it's never going to end. We're just talking about things that would happen if we lived in a reasonable world. But the government's never going to pay this debt off. Dollars will only be worth less into the future, and that's the real problem.
Meanwhile, the rest of us feel it every time we pump gas or go to the grocery store.
Anybody with an ounce of common sense knows if you consistently pay more than you bring in, by definition, you've got a problem.
Yeah, and the game between now and then is to divert attention from the real cause, divert attention from Congress. It's corporate greed. It's the Ukraine war. It's whatever it is. So, Samir, there's your episode, and you've succeeded in making James mad. So, congratulations.
I am angry. We went all the way around the block on this one, and I'm going to be yelling at people for the next hour. I guess that's it for this week. You can join us next week, hopefully for something a touch more uplifting on Words and Numbers. Until then, follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues, or do what Samir did.
Yes, keep that email coming. wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try and keep on an even keel, stay away from government debt, and try to be nice to each other. I've been remiss in reminding you these many weeks, and look at how bad everything gets when I forget to say these words. Be nice to each other. It won't take much. Give it a shot, and you'll see. And I will catch you next week.
See you next week, James.